Well, I mean, first off, thanks for having me here. It's great to be speaking with all of you. I've been really impressed with the level of discussion. So yeah, starting with a little bit of what it is that I'm responsible, what I do. It was said a bit in the introduction, but fundamentally what I do is I manage a series of rule sets. I have the administration of the Access to Information Act, and so we have a bill in front of Parliament right now, or in the Senate right now, to try and renew it. I have the administration of the Privacy Act. I have open government as a concept for the government, including the Open Government Portal. I have access to information in the portal that we're trying to deliver. And I also have a suite of administrative rules for the government, which basically send signal out into the federal civil service around how we want to manage IM, how we want to manage IT, and how we want to manage service. I don't actually manage any of the services directly myself. So that's sort of who I am on this, and what I've been asked to speak about. I've been asked to speak about technology for the public good. So I want to start by talking around the public good. I think for most of us who've been in the public sector sphere, there's probably a realization that there is no one definition of the public good. There's a series of interests, there's a series of views, and our job as public servants and people who are trying to advance initiatives for the public good is to try and balance between those. And we have to balance issues like ease of service, ensuring that people who are most vulnerable are able to access services, including by using innovative technology. We also have to balance things like providing the right conditions for economic growth. But we also have to balance them against expectations by some around, and I think we touched a lot about this in the last conversation, expectations around privacy. Expectations or concerns about overreach by public institutions. And the public sector, in a way, is very different than other actors. We have things like law enforcement. We can throw you in jail. And so when people think about government, they're not only thinking about what the most benevolent actor can do with the current rule set, they're also thinking about what does it mean in the future state? What does it mean in a situation where government may not be benevolent or may not be acting on behalf of its population with the best interests? And how have the rules we put in place limited or constrained the capacity of government to, sure, enhance good, but also negative, sort of limit the negative potential impacts of government? So that's basically my intro slide. The next one is probably, I will be telling you something that you've probably heard in 100 presentations before, which is times are changing. The change of technology, the change of information is exponential. We've created more digital information in the last two years, 90% more than ever before. This isn't new, you've all heard this before. But I think the bottom line for all of us is, for governments, this isn't business as usual. And it's challenging us. And it's challenging, I think, all governments. It is not a unique thing to the federal government. It is not a unique thing to municipal government. All governments right now are trying to think through what it means. None of us have it perfectly. And we're all learning from each other to try and figure out what does it mean to live in a world where information is drastically increasing. We've gone from a place where you used to have people like me, policy analysts, once upon a time, sort of drafting notes, putting them in cabinets, and that was the information that government has. Then we went to a world where, with social media, we started having information and stores of information being produced by the mass, as opposed to internal experts into the world. And now we're in the world where information is produced by machines. And so you being close to municipalities will be very familiar to that. So that the production, initial production, and then reproduction of that information is increasing drastically, and we're all grasping or trying to figure out how we organize to use it well, but use it responsibly as well. So I've talked to this a little bit, to the next slide in terms of the challenges it brings forward. The environment brings forward new risks and challenges. The instances of cyber attacks are increasing. We are now in a world where we are concerned about things like election proofing, safeguarding our democratic institution, thinking about disinformation, what does it mean for us? We're also in a world where trust is not in abundance. There's a global study on internet security and trust that found that 51% of Canadians are concerned about online privacy. in terms of sort of trust in government, I think it's the Edelman probably barometer that had us about at 56% in terms of trust in federal institutions. And what was interesting in one of the surveys is the level of trust between the average citizen and its level of trust has not changed dramatically over the last 2 years in terms of the federal government. We're seeing a delta in terms of trust between a segment of the population, which is sort of an informed segment of the population, and a segment of the population which feels more disconnected and where trust is dropping more rapidly. Now, why I say this is because this is important in terms of context for us who are trying to think about setting up programs, or trying to think about developing policies. It's important in terms of, I think, a theme that's been talked about here, which is social license and our capacity to act. And it's important for our politicians, who are also the ones who are in the process and have to be out in front of citizens or out in front of committees, trying to bring forward legislation. In my case, I have C-58 in front of the Senate right now. And the backdrop of trust in the institution plays in terms of the conversations and public acceptance of trying to move forward legislation and trying to do things. There's a potential for inertia for us if we don't build that trust. So what does that sort of mean for us? In many ways, technology and information, while there is a risk associated to it, also has an upside. So our capacity to deliver efficient services, our capacity for citizens to think that we are doing things well, will impact the trust they have in us. I may be in my Ottawa bubble, but the Phoenix and everything around Phoenix has dramatically affected people's trust, at least in my bubble, around government's capacity. So using technology right, delivering services better, has been shown to increase trust. The other thing that's been shown to increase trust is increased transparency. And so I have open government as a thematic. So working more openly and improving service delivery has the potential to increase trust. And in turn, we need to build that trust and that social license to be able to advance initiatives that will further be able to enhance our capacity to use technology for good. In terms of, as governments, and in particular the federal government, try to adopt new technologies, we are facing some very great opportunities, but also specific difficulties. Our existing laws and systems are primarily designed or have been thought of in a world where authorities flow down very vertically and in silos. And I can think of that in sort of the terms of the Privacy Act, which I manage. But in terms of most of our authorities, they're siloed. And so as we look at our legislation, look at renewing our rule sets, we also have to think about how they will enable us in the future to meet citizens' expectations around a seamless service and capacity for information to flow across. In addition to sort of a rule set that, say, in many cases is antiquated, so I'll go back to 2 acts that I own, which are privacy and access to information. Those 2 acts date back from 1983. They're based on the premise that individual departments will hold paper records and they will hold them in filing cabinets. And they're based on the notion that because it's that way, that privacy and the privacy of information held by citizens is increased if we're unable to share them. And so those laws and that pace of change of law has been too slow to sort of reflect the new realities where the bulk of information held by governments is no longer records, it's data, it's unstructured, and the individual holding an individual cabinet might not be the best way to secure and protect that information. On technology and legacy IT infrastructure, for governments, and I think particularly for an organization the size of the federal government, where we have close to 300 institutions, each have their own system, we are living in a legacy-heavy type of environment. And unless you're maybe Estonia in the 1990s, most governments don't get to work from a blank slate. There's massive investments that have been made into systems, and some of those systems are fragile right now. And so there's actually massive investments that are being made just to upkeep the existing systems. The last point I have on this side is failure is not an option. And that's true and not true. Again, I'll point to sort of the comment I made earlier, which is large failures decline or reduce our capacity to gain the trust of our citizens, Phoenix being my example. I think what we're trying to do right now, and what we're trying to encourage in our policies, is learning to fail better. Learning to fail smaller, learning to fail faster, a little bit of the mantra of what we heard in Agile. And you'll see as we are trying to push through the next gen, the replacement to Phoenix, we're trying to do it more openly, to be more open around our failures, and to learn that failures or small failures shouldn't be a cause for loss of public trust, but should be an accepted way of doing business. And we're challenged again on that, because a lot of our systems, whether it's around procurement, whether it's how we manage projects, are based on the notion that we will go seek approval from our political masters and cabinet instances, be able to tell them, I am pushing forward a massive project that will be $200 million, let's say, but don't worry, I have it figured out from beginning to end, and I can tell you how much it's going to cost. I can tell you exactly the steps I'm going to take and what results you're going to get at the end. And then I will go and contract, and it will say, don't worry, I'm going to put out a massive contract. It's going to be very, very fair. Everybody will be able to bid, and you will know exactly what you're getting, and you'll get certainty at that end of the contract. And that's not working for us anymore. It's not working in our current context, and we have to adapt our rule sets within the federal government to allow more nimble ways of acting. So I think that brings us to sort of the main point of my presentation, which is what can we, or us who are in the policy world, do to support digital transformation and enable adoption of technology. How do we enable better information sharing? How do we use AI ethically? How do we leverage technology to do business better? And my short answer is, well, I don't know. But essentially, we in the federal government have been sort of pushing along two axes. We've been working to try and build more enabling rules, more enabling legislation, more enabling policies. And the other component is we've tried to put an increased accent on learning by doing, like just doing stuff instead of planning it out for 20 years and accepting that there's going to be some uncertainty along the way. So first part I will touch on is, what do we mean by establish enabling frameworks? What does that look like? In a way, we are starting down that journey. And our first point of start was to establish a vision for what digital government would be. And it's outlined here and basically touches on the notion of being open and service-oriented, in terms of delivering programs that are simple, modern, and the notion of digital services that are available anywhere, anytime, and any device. This isn't something that's going to happen next year. It's not a small task. Again, 300 organizations, 300 civil servants. But we thought it was important to at least start with a statement of where we wanted to go. And this starts informing what we do after. The next thing we did is we looked at what some other governments did, and they've anchored a lot of their actions in terms of digital principles or digital standards. And so we had a very, very sort of open process by which we developed it. We looked at what was done in the UK as well as in other places, and with civil servants across from the federal government, and came up with a set of 10 digital principles. These really are intended to send a signal to the rest of the civil service around what behaviors we expect, how we expect people to think of their programs. These don't have huge teeth, but they're intended to be aspirational, they're intended to provide and guide action, and we're actually building in some teeth into this as we're looking at projects, whether we have a process where projects get approved by Treasury Board. We are looking at, in terms of to what extent people, when they're designing their initiatives from the ground up, whether it's post-budget, they are thinking and building these principles into how they are doing things. And they're basic principles, things like designing with users, using user testing to inform and improve the system again. Things like also, have you thought of what your information needs are when you're developing a program? Maybe just a quick anecdote. Prior to this job, I was working in the Privy Council office, setting up a small unit for the Prime Minister to help support informed decision making. And one of the things we're doing is a digital boardroom to inform him and support his conversations. And I was sort of entered into that job. I went to meet with the CIOs from across the government, and we'd just gone through a budget. And I asked people, like all the CIOs from around the government, how many of you were asked by your policy colleagues for input when you were putting in proposals for the budget? How many, so each of your departments are proposing projects, big initiatives. How many of you were asked, what will be the information needs? What are the systems that are out there to support them? There's not a hand that went up. We have not built the thought of technology, the thought of information management, the thought of data into our process or our thinking when we're designing programs or policies, and that's part of what needs to change. This is a scattering of things we are doing right now, and of different initiatives. I think the same way we're saying we need to learn by doing, I don't think we will be coming out with a large and complete strategy for how we will transform government into digital. We are doing things which align with our overall vision. We're doing things which align with the digital principles and advancing them to hopefully see pockets of activities and enable certain activities within the government. The first one I'll point to on the top there is open government. Open government is a broad and nebulous term. We've been in this, in my shop, sort of pushing those initiatives since 2014, but we've created a focus point within the federal government for those activities. The Open Government Portal is not something that existed forever, and now we're developing national action plans on a 2-year basis. And this is, in a sense, almost like a startup within government, trying to build traction around the notion of openness. And maybe shameless plug, we're hosting an international conference on May 29th with people 79 member countries of the OGP, so I'd love to see any of you there if you're available. The next point I'll sort of point to is cloud and cloud adoption. Also sort of going back to past stories, I was at Treasury Board in another function a few years ago when we were first creating SSC. And again, this was a exercise in how do we plan and how do we pretend that we're going to know everything we're going to do. And we planned at the time to have a fixed set of data centers, and we're going to close all the data centers that were presently in departments that varied from large data centers to a server in a closet. And that level of planning hasn't worked. But we've also created right now an environment where it's very difficult to go to cloud. And so we are putting in place a cloud-first policy, and we're also looking or advancing work to purchase protected B cloud. APIs also. I mean, this is very much part of the open government feeling. It's not something that we've been used to using in government. Our feeling or our sort of guidance to departments has been, you should be thinking of developing APIs for all your major services. And so that direction has gone out to departments and is part of our policies. That's what I want to touch on is actually an interesting one. Automated decision making. So AI, we've talked about it a few times here. Departments across the civil service are experimenting with AI. They are doing things, but sort of linking back into earlier conversations around social license, there hasn't to date, or hadn't been to date, a process or a policy around what departments should do when they think about AI. We know that data may have biases. We know that there's some risk in terms of AI, and there's different levels of risk in terms of how we use AI for the provision of services. And there hasn't been, within the federal government, a general policy on the use of AI. So we put forward a policy on AI, on automated decision making, and part of that was the development of an algorithmic impact assessment. And what that is basically a set of questions that departments have to answer when they're about to use AI for the provision of an outward-facing service that may impact Canadians, which allows an identification of key risks, and then depending on the level of risk of the use of AI, a requirement to return to Treasury Board, have additional oversight, to consult externally, those types of things. Now, intuitively, that might actually sound like it may constrain the use of AI. I actually think it's significantly mitigating certain risks because absent sort of an overall framework, individual departments are may be very hesitant to use AI because they're bearing all the risks. At least this way, we are making the risk, some of the risk and some of the decision and some of the approaches corporate, and that way providing clarity both to citizens and departments in terms of expectations when they're going to be doing AI. So I've been told I have about 5 minutes left, so I will try and go fairly quickly. On this, so some of the things we're currently looking at, we are working with Justice to look at the Privacy Act implications on departments. We are also looking to work with departments to review the existing base of legislations. So right now we have existing departmental legislations which in some cases will dictate use of technology or specific use of information. That doesn't work in a digital world, so we're looking at processes to potentially sort of look at the bulk of legislations and update them. But the next point I was going to speak to earlier, so I said we need to get the rules framework right, and we're not going to get it perfectly, but we need to at least establish the baselines and the principles and make legislation more enabling. But the other thing is we need to get better at just doing. And so, sorry, skipping back, we have been experimenting across the government, and I think we talked to the smart cities example earlier on. We've been experimenting and trying to experiment with new ways of doing. And I think, again, back to the general ethos I've said before, I don't think we want to dictate in every case how people should be doing. I think we want to try as many different ways of doing things, experiment, and then when things like, for example, the smart cities challenges work, help departments to understand what's worked, share those information so that that ecosystem grows. I think that, just skipping through here, another thing we've done, and I think Ryan is here, and he would have been one of the innovators around CDS. One of the things we've also realized is there's not a huge capacity around digital, around technology within the federal government, around user-centric practices. And so one of the things we did is, again, looking at models of what had been done in other jurisdictions, the Canadian Digital Service was established. They're essentially a SWAT team for the government on user-centric approach, digital and technology, which is able to go into departments when they have projects, work with them to deliver them in a digital fashion, and in that sense, help build capacity within departments as well. So I think I'm on time, so I'll close. Maybe a few takeaways. So the first thing is, and an obvious point is, change is happening fast. It's going to continue. Status quo is not an option, but I don't think anybody's got the perfect rules or set plan on how to deal with that. So we are looking to learn from you, to learn from other governments, and to share those lessons. The second point is, it is challenging for an organization like the federal government to adapt at that pace. There is a built-in system or process within private sector, creative destruction, if you will. Companies innovate or die, governments survive, no matter what. They are long-term. And so that doesn't build in a notion of automatic renewal. And so we need to be thinking of how do we renew in a context that is not a private sector context, is a public sector context, but at a pace that's going to continue and accelerate and won't let up. And then my last point is sort of returning on sort of the two things we're doing is thinking about how you build rule sets that are enabling as opposed to prescriptive, but that balance the need for being able to do things and enhance services while at the same time ensuring we have social license. And then the second thing is a recognition that we need to learn by doing, and that also means learn to fail and fail fast and be transparent about it. So that's a bit of a broad brush. I will open up to questions.
So I'm from Ottawa as well, so we'll talk about the Ottawa bubble for a second.
All right.
Public sector is, you could argue with this perhaps, but traditionally seen as somewhat more risk averse, and we've seen a trend recently with the public service and public servants and bureaucrats being in the limelight a little bit more, whereas traditionally they've been more the advisors in the background. So do you see that as increasing the risk aversion within government right now, and how does that affect initiatives like open government and open data, which some might argue are on the leading edge and thus therefore a little bit more risky as well? They seem to be going in divergent directions.
Yeah, so you've met my boss. He is out in the public. He's one of the civil servants who's actually pushing for more sort of work in the open. It's a very difficult balance, and we've seen it. I mean, just not telling tales out of school. I mean, we've seen the dynamic with the clerk as well, and sort of the opposition party, and his feeling that he could no longer serve them because, in terms of his public persona, he'd lost trust of the opposition, and that was sort of what he said in his letter. It's a really, really difficult balance. I think we are probably in an inevitable trend where public servants, or at least some public servants, will be more public, and I think that is part of a trend that is more work in the open. I think we need to be really careful about where and who, and in what context. I think there are things that should be, like I think advice to ministers in many cases should be kept confidential. I think we need to protect that space, and we need to be real guardians of that space. At the same time, I think there are many things that many instances where we restrain ourselves from working out in the open on the false notion that that is stuff that should only be talked about by ministers. We need to work within the constructs. We need to make sure that things that are political discussions or hot political issues remain, but we also have to recognize that we can't be insular anymore. So it's a very imperfect answer, but my answer is we need to do both. And we have to try and find that right balance. And I think we're going to run into more and more areas where we are in the gray zone, and that creates tension. I got the noise too, I guess, so I'm doing the startup thing too.
Okay, great. Oh, now it's on. Somebody else who grew up in Ottawa, I now work here in tech. I'm wondering, on your last point, the government needs to learn more by doing. I think we're all learning as well. What are some avenues that you would recommend for the private sector to collaborate with your office and with the government in general in that spirit of collective learning?
Yeah, there are so many. Like my most currently open group is my Open by Government group. We've created an area where we are collaborating with civil society. We also have a digital advisory board that Alex does. So that we've institutionalized it. I think we need to do a better job around some of the things that are coming up. I think the biggest one for this room where we will need to really speak to the private sector in a way we're not doing is around Privacy Act and privacy renewal. That has impact for all of us. And so I think we need to do a better job of outreaching, and I think we need to do a better job at pushing the information out there, and I think we will do that. And so for me, my office, the place where it'll be most important is around renewal of legislation, particularly Privacy Act. And this is a minor point, but we are in the process right now of developing something called digital policy, which is replacing IAM, IT, and service policy. I would say we were like, if I'm talking about working completely in the open, I'd be here. We were here. We had stuff on GitHub, we had stuff on social media, we sought feedback, but that was actually a shock to the system of the Treasury Board Secretariat. We're not used to working like that. So we're trying to inch our way there and creating those spaces where we're able to collaborate better, but we still have a long way to go. But if we're talking immediate opportunities, I think the next big ones for me will be around the Privacy Act. That is? Okay, well, thank you. I'm out of town. Thanks.